That is the recording started. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for this third of our EHUNineteen virtual speaker series this year. And we are here with Dr. Will Tattersdill of the University of Birmingham and his fabulous background from, remind us where that is, Will?
It's the Lapworth Museum, which is actually on Birmingham's campus, a small and very perfectly formed and recently redeveloped geology museum, which the next time you're allowed legally to come to Birmingham, you should visit.
So I'm going to quickly hand you over to Andy, who is our resident Zoom expert, who is going to talk you through how the panel is going to work, and then we will get started.
Hello, it's mainly just explaining how you might want to ask questions. So I think Will's about to give a little précis of the talk that you've all listened to and engaged with, just to sort of refresh our memories, and then we'll be open for questions. There, on this fancy Zoom webinar, there is a Q&A button below us on the sort of the black bar tab next to a yellow raise hand, and you can ask questions in there. Sometimes people forget and write in the chat anyway. If you want to be promoted to a voice asking a question, you feel like you've got more of a comment than a question, for example, or just quite an intricate question, just write Q and we can upgrade you. Or if you're shy and you don't want to ask, you don't want to vocalize the question, but you'd like to ask, you'd like to have one of us ask the question for you, write it out and we'll read it for sort of all concerned. So sort of pop your questions in the Q&A, make comments, polite comments in the chat, because they get recorded and we know what you've said, and that's basically my bit of housekeeping done with.
Great. So without further ado, I am delighted to reintroduce Dr. Will Tattersdill, Senior Lecturer in Popular Literature, Liberal Arts and National Sciences at the University of Birmingham. And most of you will have watched his paper already, but I'm just going to start by asking Will to give us a brief summary for those who might have watched it a whole week ago.
Sure, and thank you, Laura, and thank you everyone at Edgehill for having me, for inviting me. It's really nice to see so many of you here. Colleagues, students, past and present, thank you. This is an interesting new element that the pandemic has given us, is the comprehension test part, where we can see if I can remember what's in my own paper. Didn't used to have to do that. The idea came out of a particular article written by the mathematician and eugenicist Francis Galton towards the end of the 19th century, and published in a periodical called Fortnightly Review. So this is part of a larger project about science and fiction in Victorian periodicals. And in this article, Galton suggests, with a wry smile, but I argue also seriously, that it should be possible to use signals to create a kind of universal language by which we might talk to any alien ants who live on the surface of the planet Mars. And the real focus of his article is on this idea of intrinsic intelligibility, of this idea that you could make a code that could decode itself. So for me, this becomes a way of reading Victorian periodicals. I'm particularly interested in monthly magazines, London magazines. But I think it's also an opportunity to think about the relationship between science and fiction in those magazines and out of them. And it's an opportunity to think about how magazines and science fiction intersect with imperial history in particular, but the wider social mores of the fin siècle. And so in the paper, I talk about Galton a little bit and his signaling system, which is crazy and fun. How it kind of might have been inspired by other movements in the periodical press, the movements of Mars itself in the night sky, and the movements of scientists and popularizers who responded to it, and how then it gets responded to in turn by H.G. Wells is the figure I kind of picked on, although there are other echoes in his short story The Crystal Egg, and then in his long story The War of the Worlds, which were both published the year after Galton's paper. So that's what I was after. That's what I was trying to do. And I suppose the other bit of background is that this is kind of revisiting old ground for me, in the sense that this chapter is in a book that I published a few years ago, called Science Fiction and the Fan Siècle Periodical Press, Cambridge 2016. But it's also kind of starting to look forward to an edition that I'm hopefully begin to work on of H.G. Wells' short stories, some of them a selection of the short stories. So as I'm sort of starting to think about Wells as a figure again, that work is kind of creeping in here. Hopefully that is enough of a refresher for everybody, and also hopefully doesn't contradict anything in the actual video, which I haven't watched for a week. So yeah.
That's great, thank you so much. Am I muted? I'm doing the mute check. No, I'm not. So what I was supposed to say before you started there, Will, was if you want, people want to use this time to start getting their questions into the Q&A, if everyone can see the Q&A, okay? But while people do that, I wondered if I might start with a question, which had to do with the connections you were making between, when you mentioned the murders in the Rue Morgue and detective fiction and that sense of like empirical knowledge. And I wondered just if you could say a bit more about that relationship. Detective fiction seems to share a lot of those scientific ideas of the figure of the detective and his diagnostic, almost kind of medical gaze. And I wondered if there was a broader influence of detective fiction going on.
Absolutely, yeah, I think there certainly is. I mean, the very influential Poe stories were all published in the periodical press in different periodicals in America in the 30s, 40s. H.G. Wells writes an article called Popularizing Science, and I believe it's in Nature in the early 90s, in which he says that, you know, if you present a problem and then show the working through of the solution, the public can't get enough of it, or words to that effect. So he says, you know, the way we should be communicating science, and this really is, Wells is writing fiction, but really he's a science popularizer at that time. If you present the public with a challenge, with a problem to solve, and then work through how you solve it, that's much better than the kind of dry approach of just kind of conveyancing facts at them. And that's what Poe had done, and of course it's also what Galton does. So I guess a straw that was left out of the paper as I gave it was that possibility that Wells there is an influence on Galton, or at least is present in the timeline, as it were, before Galton writes his article, because that is exactly what he does. And I think the similarities between Galton's approach in that piece and Poe's in the Rue Morgue story are about constructing a form with the reader at the end of it, with the reader in the middle of it, a form that is there to invite them into a state of active participation in the thinking through of things. And that, of course, is what detective fiction is. That's all detective fiction is. And that's what Galton's going for as well. So yeah, I think it's key. And of course, as nobody in this room needs reminding, this is the decade of Sherlock Holmes. This is the decade where the eccentric scientist solving stuff performatively is as close to the front of everybody's mind as it's ever going to be, including in the periodical press.
We have our first question in the Q&A from Emily Adler. She says, question for Will. Emily, can I just check, would you like to ask this yourself, or shall I read this out for you? Do you just want to let us know in the chat? I would hate to steal your moment. Give Emily a few seconds, and if not, we will proceed. Yeah, we'll proceed. Oh, I can read it. Thank you, Emily. So, question for Will. Thank you for the fascinating examination of Galton and Wells. Could you elaborate further on one of your closing points in the talk about the political importance now of arts and sciences talking to each other?
Thank you. Hi, Emily. I feel like this is Emily serves with me on the exec of the British Society for Literature and Science. So I'm pretty sure that she could answer this question better than I can. But I will try. I think when I was writing this book, it was one of the things that was politically important to me was this idea of doing something beyond dialogue between that old cliche of the two cultures. It's not so much about questioning that model as pointing out that it has never actually worked, and that if you take any moment from the history of literature and science, you can find them working together. In fact, you have little choice, in my opinion, against each other as well. Of course, there are conflicts. I think that in Galton's case, what I really wanted to do was draw attention to the fact that whether you like it or not, that's an article for which the imaginative and kind of humorous, and for want of a better word, literary element of it is completely inseparable from the scientific training and expertise that Galton has to come up with. That it is a serious idea that he's presenting with a serious agenda, even though that agenda may not actually be Martian communication, but just instructing the public in some mathematical ideas about language. But nevertheless, that's the key. And I think he is seriously interested in doing that. So it's not capricious, or at least not in the way that it frames itself as being. So Gillian Beer has a lovely phrase for this sort of thing, where she says that of the origin, of the Darwin's Origin of Species, she says that the narrative elements of the origin cannot be skimmed off without a loss. You can't just pretend they're not there for the purpose of treating the origin as a scientific text. And that's basically the thinking that I was applying to this piece as well. Once you've understood that that you don't read the whole text if you choose to speak of it only as a scientific text or a literary text, then in my opinion, you're a good deal closer to, well, two things. One, the true complicated dynamic and incredibly difficult to trace relationship between literature and science as it actually exists. And two, the patently obvious, which is, of course, these things are connected. How could they not be? And it felt like so much of the work I do is to get back to these things that should be really obvious, but aren't, because of the walls that have been thrown up by the science wars and by the two cultures debate and so on. So yeah, when I talk about the political importance of them talking to each other, I suppose I mean, as an historicist, I mean that we lose any sense of nuance in our history when we forget to do this. And I think also there is a kind of "and right now" part of the equation, which is that I do believe, I started my PhD in the belief, and doing everything I've done since has not changed it, that we lose every day that artists and scientists aren't talking to each other in meaningful ways, that we have created in the modern academy structures that are designed to discourage that, well, not designed to do it necessarily, but that do discourage it. And that we need some new paradigms if we're going to solve, the big problems that we face today. They are interdisciplinary problems. They are not problems that any one science or art will fix alone. So I think it's really important. There we go. That's a very long answer. I'm really sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you, Emily, for the question. I apologise for mispronouncing your name the first time. But yeah, Will, I thought your paper did a really lovely job of sort of foregrounding the periodical press of the 1890s as a space where those connections and where those discussions were sort of flowing in a much more fluid way than perhaps they are today. That really came through. Elizabeth Miller has asked a question. She says, "Thank you for the fascinating talk. Could I ask you to say a bit more about your point that fin de siècle writings like Wells are not science fiction, but not science fiction, and that sci-fi doesn't really emerge until the 1930s. Can you say a little more? I know the term came later, but I'm curious to hear what seems distinctive about this era's sci-fi, not sci-fi boundaries."
It's a lovely question, Elizabeth. yeah, so as a critic of science fiction, an enormous amount of energy has been expended in the last half century on identifying where science fiction starts, and the answers chronologically start with Homer and end sort of around the 1950s. And it's a conversation that I try to avoid wherever I can, because there's no first anything, right? Sherlock Holmes says there's nothing new under the sun. He's quoting Ecclesiastes. That's Conan Doyle's little joke. When I say they're not science fiction and they're not science fiction, what's going on in my head there is, yeah, they're not science fiction in that formal sense, because the conceit of a self-identifying genre called science fiction doesn't meaningfully exist. I would argue until the very early 1930s. 1926 is a watershed year. That's when we get an American magazine called Amazing Stories, edited by Hugo Gernsback, which collects which is a discrete publication that is just for science fiction, and that's the first time that happens in English. But what's interesting about that is that every single story that Gernsback publishes in that first edition had been published before in a different periodical that was not about science fiction. So it's very much about drawing a ring about something that already existed, rather than, as it claimed to be, the creation of something completely new. So retrospectively, Wells identifies these works as scientific romances. That's his phrase, but again, it's from the late 1920s, I think, when he starts calling them that. I think someone might be able to correct me about that, but I'm tolerably confident that that's another retrospective label. So a lot of these things are kind of identified with the power of hindsight, and so when we look at Wells's big scientific romances, science fiction, whatever you want to call them, of the 1890s, there is this question about, well, to its first audience, it wasn't science fiction. That term wasn't available, but not just the term, right? The conceit of that particular kind of writing as distinct from the rest of what is sometimes called the new romance, you know, as distinct from the writings of H. Rider Haggard, say, or Robert Louis Stevenson, or Bram Stoker. I think that this is another great reason to read periodicals and to find things in their original periodical publications, because that sense of what the first readers could see when they saw these things, which is, you know, you get Westminster character sketches, and you get articles about photographs of cats, which do massively predate the internet, as Bob has surely told most of you already. You get all sorts of fiction all glued in together, and instead of this idea of science fiction as the weird nerd enclave of kind of where the 20th century rejects go to think about what the future is going to be like, you see that it's something that comes up very organically and emerges out of the fabric of the print culture of the time. Something that is absolutely intrinsic to how stories are told once we have this level of readership and technology. So yeah, so that's when I say they aren't science fiction. They're not science fiction because they're not called that, and they're not in science fiction magazines. But precisely because of that, they are science fiction, because they're crucial in identifying that canon later.
Fantastic, thank you very much. The questions are coming thick and fast, so I'll power through some of these.
I'm going to try and make my answers quicker as well, because I'm being very indulgent here. So
that's okay. They're great answers. Kerry Goodall asks, how is the forensic problem solving of science in tension with religion in the period you're looking at? Or is it, and how?
The forensic problem solving of science.
That idea of the sort of that kind of diagnostic problem solving drive of science, tension there with religion.
Yeah, so a really good question. It's sort of out of my area, to be honest. I'm not completely comfortable with this one. I would say that the idea that science and religion is straightforwardly in tension in the late 19th century is, it's more complicated than that. I think, so a lot of students, and indeed occasionally the odd professor, comes around thinking that, you know, it's just religious oppression until Darwin and then there's no God anymore. And it's a much more complicated position than that. There is, you know, that there is, for certainly, I mean, the scientists I know the most about, I suppose, in regards to this particular question, are from slightly earlier in the 19th century, current work about dinosaurs, and those geologists who are making those big discoveries in the early 19th century about extinction and deep time and all of these other things that are shaking up the biblical paradigm, are often doing it in spite of themselves, or as a performance of their faith in creation. To understand the world is to be able to marvel at the complexity of God's accomplishment. And even though those discoveries end up, for many people, counting against the Christian account of creation and of how the world works, they're very often not intended that way. And actually, a lot of scientists get quite good at holding the apparent contradiction within themselves, even at this late point in the century, when it all seems a bit more hopeless. Now, that hopelessness, which is associated with decadence and kind of epitomized almost by the time machine, where the time traveler goes into the very far future and finds that there was nothing special about people at all. That's, you know, that's taken to be a mood of the period, and I think this is a period where that tension is starting to develop. Freud's going to come along and mess with it some more, of course, at the very start of the 20th century. But I don't think there is that direct tension in the time that we're talking about. And I think that even though people like Wells occasionally describe themselves as blasphemers, Wells calls The Island of Dr. Moreau his little blasphemous book, and is very thoughtful about religion in it. But I don't think he comes from a straightforward perspective of, here's the forensic method and it's going to wipe out your naive Christianity. I think it's much more complicated than that.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Kerry, for that question. If we've got any students here who haven't read The Island of Dr. Moreau, I very much recommend it. But for now, our next question is coming from Molly Watson, who asks, is Galton the only eugenicist with an interest in Mars and Martian communication?
This is a lovely question. Molly, I have no idea at all. I am definitely not going to say no. He's the only one I've found. But another thing about the periodical press is that it's massive. You can never prove an absence. So I don't believe that any of the eugenists who respond to Galton directly do so using Mars as one of their things. Like I said in the talk, it's not regarded as central to his eugenic writings, although I think we can detect those attitudes in it if we go in looking for them. But across the 20th century, if there was absolutely no eugenicists who trying to do something with it, I would kind of be surprised. I don't know who they are. I would love it if anybody found it and wanted to get in touch with me. But yeah, that's a simple I don't know answer.
If anyone finds any other eugenicists with an interest in Martians, please tweet us at EHUNineteen, tagging Dr. Will Tattersdill, because we would love to know.
We would, and because as well, you know, this is the other thing about, this is the other perversity of eugenics, right? Is that we can imagine talking to Martian ants before we can imagine treating the majority of the human race as people. You know, that's the outrage of it, of course. I probably wasn't angry enough about it in my talk because Galton's hilarious, but he is also horrific. So yeah, it's a really important question.
Thank you very much, Molly. Our next question is from Matthew Sangster, who I think we're going to promote.
Yeah.
Ask us out. Here's Matthew.
I was just while Matthew sort of gets orientated in his new reality, I was just going to think we're going to have to try and phrase that tweet carefully, like collect. We want to collect eugenicists.
Yeah, be
Yeah.
very careful.
I think I can my voice be heard?
We can hear you now, Matt.
We can.
Yeah. They promoted me because I've written an essay instead of a question, Will, so I apologize for that. The text should be available to you as well, but I'll just sort of summarize sort of quickly. So there are sort of two interlinked questions about sort of this point where disciplinarity becomes too complicated. So one relates to your sort of presentist argument. So what do we in some ways need to go back to this sort of space in the 1890s or earlier in terms of thinking about general interest magazine? If so, what's sort of inadequate about places like The Economist or The Guardian that try and do that sort of unpacking of science for a larger audience? And the other is sort of about the kind of trajectory from sort of the 19th century towards the two cultures argument, because the way you were describing magazines in the 1890s magazines, the talk still sounds like some of the characteristics of the sort of early 19th century magazines where fiction and scientific discourse and all sorts of things are mixed sort of heterogeneously on the pages. This is David Stewart's argument about magazines and metropolitanism from the sort of 1815 to 1825 period his book focuses on. So is there, I'm just wondering to what extent that sort of specialist economy that we think of now, where scientific journals are very, very different from popular newsprint, to what extent has that emerged in the Victorian period? It also occurred to me that arts and sciences phrasing that Galton uses is an old phrasing. It's an 18th or early 19th century phrasing where the arts are more practical and the sciences are more general. There's a really interesting account of that phrasing's transformation in John Clanch's Transfiguring the Arts and Sciences, and I wondered whether Galton is using those as a sort of collective or as separate things, what your sense is of that. Sorry, again, that was an essay rather than a question, so take any part of it and ignore the boring bits.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, goodness me, where to begin with that? Okay, I think I want to defend my presentism. I do think we should be responsible to history, but I think we're all reading these things now, and I think what's important is what we can do with them now. And I think we're not in a moment where it's trendy to acknowledge that. But meaning is made in the space between the page and the brain. It's not inherent in the text. And I'm not going to apologize for that. I think that I think that's a very perceptive remark about the general interest, the idea of general interest as a model for something that could work now. Even in my most naive moments, and I have fewer of those than I used to, I don't believe that relaunching the Strand magazine would solve the climate crisis. And one of the reasons that I believe that is that someone tried it, and I think it still exists as an online publication. There is a Strand magazine that is publishing at the moment, I believe, out of America. I think the model that they offer us is not a publication model for now, so much as a way of thinking, so much as a different way of understanding the past. Because one of the dangers of these categories we have, and you said it yourself, Matt, is that we impose them retrospectively, and the arts and sciences mean something different to us. To be a scientist or an artist, those words carry inflections now that they didn't used to. These things are always changing. The general magazines of the 1890s were extraordinarily febrile and exciting place for quite a short period of time. The formal dates of my study are 1891 to 1905. That's a 14-year period between the launch of the Strand magazine and the arrival of the first slicks, which kind of changed the game again, moved us in a very slightly more specialized direction. Specialization is good, we solve disease with specializing. That's fine. I don't have a problem with it. Losing sight of the general completely is a risk as well, in my opinion, and the magazines help us to see that. But we have to remember that they were also bifurcating in other ways. They gave only seriously stymied expression to women. They weren't interested in publishing people who weren't white at all. You know, as inclusive as they are in terms of genre, they are exclusive in all sorts of other ways. So I definitely don't think that the answer is to go back to them in that sense. When I say we should go back to them, I mean we should turn back to them, look at them again as whole things, and possibly this is not the right response to your nuanced, multi-part and really interesting question, is to like add something else in on top of it. But I think I think in many ways the problem in some ways is one of how we access these materials now, that they've all been digitized, because now if we're lucky enough to be working on something that has been scanned, we just see the scan. We don't see the issue. We don't see what it was published with. We don't understand what it's alongside in the mind of its first reader. And we lose that sense of what it was. You are separating parts from wholes there in ways that we should be uncomfortable with, but very few of us are. And I'm like, the extreme version of this is you can't write about an H.G. Wells short story unless you've read every other issue of the Pall Mall Budget. And of course, that's physically impossible. And yet I do and yet part of me sort of thinks, but what if we tried that a little bit? Because we miss so much. And that is, I suppose, back to the presentism thing again. That's what I want to use these publications to do, is to see the stuff that we normally miss. And then to do that, hopefully, is to open ourselves to the possibilities of other fields and other ways of thinking and other methodologies. Oh my goodness, and that even was only half of your question. Oh my gosh. So then the romance thing. I think that the difference, of course, there are huge parallels between these magazines and the romantic ones. And very briefly, because I've been talking for ages now, what I would say is, to me, the big difference between those early century publications and these ones, well, two big differences. Firstly is degree of access, because you've just got so many more readers. That kind of convenience as well, that idea of the commuter reading it on the train and stuff like that. And secondly, I think illustration is another thing that changes enormously after the half-turn process, which is 86, I think. You get a kind of visual literacy that builds up around these things that I think makes it a different conversation, but I don't think a more important conversation. And I'm certainly not trying to take away from the Romantic period any of its traditional access to the what am I trying to say? To the "we got there first" kind of argument. That was really long. I'm sorry, and a lot of it was tangential. But hopefully it's an essay to match yours. Right.
That was great, Will. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. So we have got a question from Joshua Null now. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And he says, "Hi, Will. Could you clarify the type of eugenic or proto-eugenic thinking that you read into Galton's Mars piece? Is Galton using the piece to reflect on the future of human evolution, i.e. Mars as a future Earth, as Lowell was just beginning to do at the time, or is he simply using Mars to show off the power of his contemporary mathematical reason?"
Yeah, thank you very much, Joshua. So I think as far as Galton pitches it, it's the latter. This is just about mathematical reason. It's just an exercise. But of course, for Galton, eugenics is also just about mathematical reason, right? That's the danger of eugenics, is that it wears the robe of objective truth. So the history of this idea is that it begins in a lecture that Galton gave in 1893 called The Just Perceptible Difference. That was a public lecture. And in that lecture, which contains a sort of early draft of this signaling idea, he's talking in a very abstract way about planet A and planet B, who are signaling to each other. He doesn't even say that it's Mars and Earth, although it obviously is, partly because that exchange of letters in the Times has just happened, that I mentioned in the talk, and partly because he sort of gives away some other clues that it's Mars. But crucially, in his lecture, and this is where, you know, for those of us who like form, we can start getting really excited. In that lecture, Earth is sending the signals, and Mars is a blank, and it doesn't matter what's there. It doesn't matter who's there. That's not what this idea is about, because the lecture is about, okay, we have this problem. We can send signals, but what should we say in them? Let's figure it out. For the article, Galton flips it. Earth is the recipient now, and the process of how these signals were devised is irrelevant. The senders are opaque, but they have that comparable intelligence, that that sophistication that Galton wants. Now I think, for my money, and I think other readings are available of the article, but I think that for Galton there, what's going on is Wells's popularizing science idea, right? That it's more engaging and easier to follow for a layperson if we're following the decoding process rather than the encoding process. But what that does on the genre side is that obliges us into this question of who lives on Mars, which on the surface of it is not a question that Galton is interested in at all. It doesn't matter to the idea, except then these ideas about mad billionaires and alien ants and stuff start to nibble at the edges of it. And I think, kind of in spite of himself, that he ends up stuck with a science fiction universe. So I don't think that he's directly engaged with Lowell's idea about the future Earth thing, although I think it's almost certain that he would have known about it and been interested in it. But he doesn't evoke that on the page. It's the communication idea and that alone that interests him. But, and this is kind of my wider point, you can't be interested just in that. It doesn't work, it can't work. And so you end up having to describe the other stuff. And I don't know, I mean, a student asked me about this a while ago, and I ended up comparing it to Harry Potter, as we all must, and saying, look, the reason it doesn't work, sorry everyone, is that the first book is not the first part of this big epic. That's not how she's thinking about it, right? The genre changes as the success goes on and as she changes what it is in her mind. So I think Galton ends up with sci-fi that he wasn't planning for. Not that he didn't want, but that he wasn't planning for. And then he's trying to manage that risk. That's slightly separate from where the eugenic thinking comes from. And I read that out of the piece because of my knowledge of his other writings. I don't think he sits down to be a eugenicist in this moment, but I think it emerges, if nothing else, in the mathematical, in prioritizing the mathematical above everything else, and in assuming that a completely alien civilization is reducible to numbers, basically. That is the same kind of reasoning, not the same reasoning, but the same kind of reasoning that drives Galton's eugenic thinking elsewhere. Hope that's a reasonable answer.
Great, thank you. And a quick question from Kate Holterhoff here. Have you read George Griffith's A Honeymoon in Space?
Have I ever?
The theme of interplanetary extinction has some interesting intersections with evolution and Galton.
Does it ever? I think, Kate, all I will say to that is yes. I actually, when I was a PhD student, I wrote a whole article that was just about Honeymoon in Space, and it got rejected. And then I was going to, I'll fix it and send it somewhere else. And then that thing happened where you don't. One day I will publish something about Honeymoon in Space when I get around to it. It's, for those of you who don't know it, serialized in 1900 in the Strand magazine, I think. Completely insane. So what happens in this insane book is that this super rich British lord marries the daughter of an American inventor who has just invented the first spaceship. The inventor dies, and they take their honeymoon on the spaceship, and they visit. Each installment is a different planet, and what tends to happen is that they kill everything because they're horrible imperialists. And it's a really great read, and I don't understand why it isn't more widely known. But yeah, one day I'll write something about it. Thank you, Kate.
Oh, great question. So we now have a take-home reading, recommended read, as well as a Twitter challenge. While people think of some more questions, I wonder if I could ask one that has been brewing in my mind since I watched your paper.
Yeah.
And to do with, I guess what I've scribbled down here is, from that mention you make of the first men in the moon, is there a difference in the sort of Victorian imagination between Mars and the moon? Like, is as part of that imperial arrogance you mentioned, is the moon treated as somehow more ours as opposed to Mars?
Wow, what a great question. I think there's not one answer to that question, because I think different writers are just imagining these places so differently. They're so vague through the telescope that, you know, it's kind of open season. The moon is a bit different and yet the same, because you've got the dark side, right? Which nobody knows what's there until absurdly late in the 20th century. I think that, yeah, what do I think about that? I'm not sure the moon is ours for the Victorians in the same way that it certainly is in science fiction of the 20th century now. Yeah. It's still a long way away and very alien and horrible. When there are nasty, aggressive alien rivals to humanity, they are much more likely to be Martian than Selenite, in my experience. But that doesn't mean there are no nasty Selenites, as Wells himself shows us. I mean, just staying within Wells, I suppose what's interesting is that that he writes that book 3 years after War of the Worlds. And it is a very different thing. It's much funnier for a start. But the Selenites are really, really different from the Martians, even though they both represent very alien, and not just in the sense of extraterrestrial, but very unfamiliar civilizations who are in some respects much more advanced than humanity, and who therefore represent a threat. You know, that is the same idea. But of course, the crucial change is that we go to them. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like whenever anyone goes to a new planet, whenever a human goes to a new planet in science fiction, I was about to say in H.G. Wells, but I almost think this is true universally. They're there to do something dodgy and colonial. Yeah, Mars is no exception. In the Honeymoon in Space, they arrive on Mars, and a Martian comes forward, and he's very tall and quite ugly, and has a kind of one of those big hyper-developed brain things that you get in Star Trek later, Melkorians, and they don't like the look of him, and he's saying something and gesticulating violently with his arms, so they shoot him in the head, and then they leave. He could have been saying anything. I mean, that is an article, that is a story that hasn't learned anything from Galton, for sure.
And it's almost the flip version of your the episode from Wells with the white flag.
Absolutely.
No,
yeah,
sort of universal comprehension of that.
It could be right. It could be that, right? And again, that failure to grasp, which of course Wells understands, right? This is the other thing about Wells. I try not to go to bat for Wells too often, but I mean, he is awesome in some ways, and he really gets it. And so few of them do. These universal signals aren't universal if we're thinking about other worlds, because you have to redo your idea of universality. White doesn't necessarily, the white flag doesn't mean what you want it to mean anymore.
I can see Andy's brain whirring on the film Arrival.
Yeah.
The idea of languages, yeah.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. After a short story published in a periodical by Ted Chiang called Stories of Your Life, which is absolutely wonderful, and which I thoroughly recommend someone who really understands this stuff. I see that Andrew has posted in the chat a link to Honeymoon in Space, and I could not possibly be more thrilled.
My eyes were whirring not at arrival, but at the images on the Honeymoon in Space Gutenberg.
Oh, they're wonderful.
They're well worth
Wonderful.
clicking through when after this, obviously, but you shouldn't do what I've been doing, which is scrolling madly through Honeymoon in Space, which looks like a delight.
One of the illustrations in that is of, you know, if anyone wants to argue that this text is not imperialist, because of the low gravity conditions in space, our heroine is able to pick up a Maxim gun from the deck of the ship and use it to massacre people. You know, these are the big, for those of you who don't know, the big things that were welded to the tops of British destroyers and were, you know, became emblematic of British repression globally. And so here you have a frail woman who can pick one up because there's low vacuum, like low gravity in space. It's perfect. I mean, you barely need to write the article, actually. I can see why it was rejected.
We have a really good question from Hadass Elba Abiram in the comments here. They say, is there a difference in the representation of Mars between the British and American press in the 19th century?
Yes, there is. And to be honest, I'm not the person to answer it. There's a wonderful book by Robert Crossley called Imagining Mars, which is a detailed transhistorical account of this, and it is very sensitive to transatlantic difference. I think the differences, for our purposes, they're relatively small because we are beginning to homogenize across the Atlantic a little bit more, and certainly Lowell's important discoveries in America are making their impact felt in Britain at pretty much the same time. So in terms of discoveries, we're more or less on the same page. That old separation is starting to wear away. There are different cultural meanings of Mars, of course, and of course all the imperial baggage, although present in America, is inflected very differently. The small example I will give of this is one of the first plagiarized versions of War of the Worlds that was published in Boston, just on the eve of there being proper international copyright law, but it wasn't there yet. So there's an amazing serialization of the War of the Worlds by H.C. Wells, it's a hot mess in all sorts of ways. But one of the really interesting changes is of course, like every subsequent adaptation of the War of the Worlds, they change where the aliens are landing. So they're now landing just outside Boston, as opposed to just outside London. And the route that the Martians take into the center of the city is exactly the route that the British took in the War of Independence. They follow it exactly. So there's some imperial echoes for you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that question. Our next one, hi Will, I think we're about to get a book for our recommended reading list here. Fiona Schroeder says, hi Will, I would love to read that article on A Honeymoon in Space if you ever get around to publishing it. I was wondering if you've read Robert D. Brain's Messages from Mars via the Telescope Plant, and if so, what are your thoughts about the interplanetary communication in that novel and the form of eugenics being practiced by the Martians?
Fiona, I've got to hold my hands up. I've never even heard of it. I am so sorry. I am writing it down, and I will not stay ignorant, for I am a scholar. When is it? Is it recent, or is it 19th century? Oh, I've got it. Here we are, 1892. There we go.
Ooh.
New York. That's my excuse. But no, this is something I should know about and don't, and I'm very grateful to you for bringing it to my attention.
Thank you very much. We will revisit that on Twitter as well.
Oh, this looks fun.
We should have a collective reading group where we all read it.
I'm up for it. Let's
do it. And our current final question, as we enter into the last sort of 8 minutes or so, Christopher Richter Rodick asks, hey Will, hopefully a quick follow-up question. Have you come across other short fiction that engages with the intricacies of interplanetary communication around that time?
At that time, really interesting. Let me see. So the answer, Christoph, is almost certainly yes. However, my mind isn't what it was at the start of this pandemic, and I am not able to call anything good to mind immediately other than the stuff that we've already talked about. I think that the crystal egg is important here because that idea that it establishes of the sort of the quantum entangled things, although of course he doesn't call them that you might use to talk to each other across vast distances. That's the beginning of that. And of course, back in the disgustingly boring real world, we're starting to get radio and upgrades in the transatlantic cable and things like that. So it's reasonable to assume that there's more of this stuff. And I'm annoyed with myself for not being able to think of a particular example for you right now. But I'm certain it exists, and that I will wake up at 3 tomorrow morning and kick myself for looking like a fool. 2 questions in a row.
It's well getting on to dinner time, like flagging brains are to be expected.
Thank you though, Christoph. It's a useful question, and yeah, I would be amazed if there weren't better answers to it than the one I have given.
Thank you so much. As in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to put you on the spot with a couple of questions that my students have asked me to ask you, Will.
Lovely.
To really put you on the spot with the first one. On a scale of 1 to 10, how convinced are you by the Sauron influence?
Oh, okay. That's a lovely question. I think, I mean, for resonance, 10. They're really similar ideas. Whether I'm convinced that Tolkien sits down, reads Wells, goes, that's interesting, and like puts it in the book. 3, but I don't think it matters. I think trying to establish those kinds of proofs of influence is a mug's game in literary criticism, because you can never do it, because there's no such thing as evidence. Authors lie constantly and misremember all the time. So I don't know if it was conscious. I certainly don't know that it wasn't conscious. But what's important to me is the echo, and the echo is huge because it's not just 2 orbs that you can gaze into and communicate across a huge distance, although that arguably would be enough. But it's also the corrupting influence of the orb. So like Denethor, the guy in the story, gazes too long into the crystal, looks at his view of Mars for too long, and he starts to become closed off, and eventually meets a tragic end. So so that idea, not just that you could communicate across these vast distances, but there'd be something kind of creepy about doing that. So I think it's a very persuasive comparison. It's not mine, it's Ursula Le Guin's.
Brilliant. Thank you. And a final question from another one of my students to end on, I guess, unless anyone has any closing questions. What are some of your favourite modern Martians and adaptations, and why?
Oh, wow.
I had to say that one for a big finale.
Okay, favourite modern Martians, so we mean 21st century?
Yeah, post-Victorian, I guess, but
okay.
Modern Martians was the phrase.
I mean, I think one of the really frustrating things about being alive now is that you know the answer with Mars, or I mean, we believe that we do, don't we? I mean, whatever is up there in terms of life, there isn't a beautiful city and all of the rest of it, and it hurts to live in that world. So in a way, I like the older idea that we might be, that we might be living adjacent with this glorious civilization and what was left of one. because now science fiction writers who are aiming for anything like plausibility, of course, situate their aliens considerably further afield. I guess
Go further afield if you prefer.
Sorry?
We can go further afield if you prefer.
I mean, well, no, I mean, the questions about Mars, and there is something particular about Mars, I think. I mean, a good recent example is a series of books, and it's now a TV show, The Expanse, originally books by James S.A. Corey, which is set in a sort of medium distance future in which the planets have been colonized, but also Earth has been half destroyed by climate change. And you've ended up with a united Earth, but also a united Mars, and they're kind of at loggerheads. And Martian society is very much built around, scarcity. They have to live in domes and stuff like that. And so they're very angry about what they perceive as the way the Terrans have wasted their opportunities, basically. So, I mean, what interests me about it is that you get a quite sort of spiteful, resentful, war-oriented, militaristic, hierarchical society, and it always comes back with Mars to that. It's always the war god of the Romans is hanging around in the background. This is something that Crossley says. So it's interesting that these depictions of Mars always seem to kind of circle back on themselves. But then, you know, in the Star Trek universe, Mars is where Utopia Planitia is. It's where they build the spaceships. So that's a more hopeful deployment of Mars, I suppose.
Nice, hopeful place to end on.
Thank you so much.
We've got a minute left in our session, but I just want to say another big thank you to Will for being here on behalf of everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for putting up with me for 2 entire hours of your life. It's endlessly flattering, and I regret that I can't be with you in person. But I'm also really glad that some people were able to be here who might not have been otherwise, and that's a really lovely thing about the current moment. So thank you for inviting me.
It really is, and thank you to everyone who's asked questions. Thank you for listening in, and I will just at the very end here, I will take a quick second to remind everyone of our next upcoming session. Date for the diary, save the date, Wednesday the 10th of March. Dr. Eleanor Dobson is coming also from the University of Birmingham to talk about
She's awesome.
Egyptian magic. So we're really looking forward to that, and she's found an amazing image there.
That is one of the best images.
It's one of my favourites. So date for everyone's diaries, and otherwise I'll just say thank you.
We also have a couple of like non-seminar series related events coming up. There's a Jane Austen and Country Houses, and a visual culture in the 19th century in relation to sort of debates about wokeness currently. So with those things coming up in EHUNineteen, keep your eyes on our Twitter feed.
Yes, they are. There's information on our Twitter feed, and there's a little bit of information as well about our upcoming MA in 19th century studies. If anyone's interested in that or wants more information or has students who you think might be interested, then please feel free to point them our way. We're really excited to talk about it, and we'll happily chat with you. So thank you, everyone. I release you all to have some dinner. Thank you very much. I will stop recording now.